hello to you and welcome to this Talks at Google. And it's a first today, it's actually Talks at Home. My name's Matt Brittin. I'm working from home, and although I'm not sure this really counts as work, because it's a delight for me to be hosting today from London, and I'll be bringing you two British accents in conversation. So a warm welcome to you all. We're live on YouTube, where you can make a donation to the WHO COVID Relief Fund. So please do donate. And there's also a chance to have your questions asked. So put your questions in the YouTube chat for our guest. Our guest, Derren Brown, is a best-selling author, broadcaster, unique performer, and a psychological illusionist. He's been delighting and baffling audiences here in the UK and around the world for over 20 years. You might have seen him on TV, playing Russian roulette live, or convincing middle managers to commit armed robbery. He has stuck viewers at home to their sofas, so watch out for your backsides during this chat. He motivated a shy man to land a packed passenger plane from 30,000 feet. He persuaded a racist to change his ways. And he created, as you do, a zombie apocalypse. Sacrifice is his most recent of his Netflix specials. You may have seen them. That was on from last summer. Amazing shows on Netflix. He's often been on stage, most recently playing Broadway with his show Secret, which ran until January of this year. He's the author of Tricks of the Mind, a 2007 book I remember reading well, Meet the People with Love, Confessions of a Conjurer, and the 2016 Sunday Times bestseller, Happy, subtitled, Why More or Less Everything is Absolutely Fine. Let's hope it is. Let's meet Derren Brown.
Hello, watch out for your backside.
What a way to start, Derren. And can I just say, you look fantastic. You seem to have a crayfish on your shoulder, which is also an unusual way to start.
Yeah, it is. I've got a modest taxidermy collection, and some of them are behind me. That is indeed well identified as a crayfish. A lot of people say lobster, and they're wrong.
Well, I was going. It's one or the other, wasn't it? And so you're in lockdown with your stuff. With your stuff too. Yeah. How is it for you?
I'm actually secretly enjoying it. I'm writing a lot. I'm writing a follow-up book to the Happy book that you so kindly mentioned. And sort of have new TV projects that I don't know when we're going to film them, which are in the pipeline, and a new tour as well. So, which got postponed. We were about to open when all this happened.
Yeah.
So I've kind of, I'm keeping myself busy and tidying a lot of time, which is good.
You've said in interviews in the past that you're very good at avoiding anything that might feel stressful. Is that been something you've drawn on during this period?
Yeah, I have, which actually is a good segue into the philosophy behind the book and the philosophy of happiness within the book. I resonate a lot with the Stoic notion of happiness, which is when I discovered it, I realized it sat very well with me, which is what then led to writing about it. I quite like the idea that happiness is. It's very hard to put your finger on if you see it as a thing, because then it's just a thing that maybe other people have and you don't have, and a bit like a rainbow, which is a good image for happiness. The closer you get to it, the further and further it seems to recede. Whereas if you see it as an avoidance of stress, as an avoidance of unnecessary disturbance, which is how it used to be perceived. Stoicism was the most popular school of philosophy for 500 years before Christianity kind of exploded into the scene and took over that whole question. And their model was about achieving a sort of tranquility. So they see it almost as a negative, as an avoidance of something, and it becomes an easier model to then get your head around how you might then achieve that, which I'm sure we'll speak about.
So what drew you? You said you've become fascinated by Stoicism. So what drew you into that? Because really, you're a sort of one of the things that stood out in your book to me was you talk about storytelling and sort of the magical side of what you do is about making us join dots in a way that tell a story that becomes an impossible story. So what drew you from that world into thinking about philosophy and Stoicism? What's the connection for you?
So I began my career as a hypnotist, and then a kind of a close-up magician doing card tricks and that kind of thing, and then moved into a purely psychological realm of magic, which has sort of sustained the last 20 years. But what interested me least about magic is that subtext it generally has of, hey, look at me, aren't I clever? And what started to increase me more, just as I grew up, was the realization that magic, despite all its kind of cheap and tacky associations, where you're basically just trying to impress people, it's the quickest fraudulent route to impressing people, is actually quite an interesting analogy for how we deal with the world. So we have this infinite data source coming at us. There's an infinite number of things that we could think about or pay attention to, but we choose what to pay attention to. We edit and delete, and we make up a story about what's happening to make sense of what's going on. And then we mistake that for reality, make that story for reality. And of course, the magicians are sort of doing the same thing, that they're feeding you a certain amount of information and making you join up the dots in a certain way. One of the most interesting things about magic is that, the hand is quicker than the eye. Generally, all the information you need to piece together a trick has happened right in front of you, but you've been sort of nudged to find some things important and other things not important. And this is the nature of storytelling. If you think about it, a story classically is told in a like a clearing by a fireside, and what that involves is a whole load of darkness, a whole area that is omitted from this little cozy clearing here. So all this information, all this complexity, and all this conflicting, difficult stuff is kept out. And what a narrative does is reduce things to something that's comfortable, but you're keeping all that at bay. And I think particularly in our current world, not so much right now with this lockdown, but just the general mood of how things have been, and the very notion of story, one story, and being written in and out of stories and so on, becoming more part of the sort of mainstream. I think it's actually quite important to realize it isn't just about owning your story and owning your narrative. It's also about realizing it is just a story. And like with a magician doing a trick, there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on that we don't know about and we haven't paid attention to, and starting to allow for that.
So storytelling, and obviously your expertise at pointing at the dots you want us to join up in telling a story, is something you've really crafted over a long period of time. But how did that lead you more into this realm of thinking about the nature of happiness? What was it for you that led you in that direction? Because
one of the big lessons of the Stoics, which is an idea we're still familiar with nowadays, but it's kind of lost some of its power, is that it isn't events in the world that cause our problems. It's the stories we tell ourselves about them. It's our response to those events. So what that brings with it is the importance of that particular kind of storytelling, the way we form a narrative about what's happened, that we infer cause and effect, that we're essentially projecting onto a raw event. That's one big lesson of the Stoics. And another, which ties in with this idea of avoiding unnecessary disturbance and preserving a sort of tranquility, which I think fitted me just because I'm a bit sort of introverted, and I've always felt relatively kind of tranquil inside, is this other idea, which once you've got your head around the whole, it's not the events, it's your judgment of those events is important. Second sort of stage to it, this is huge, I think, is saying there are things in the world that you're in control of. There are things that you're not in control of. And if you try and control things that you are not in control of, that's when you're going to cause stress and anxiety and frustration because you can't control them. But the only things you are in control of are your thoughts and your actions. So that's it. Everything else, what other people do and what they think of you and how things just go and the rest of circumstances and so on, you're not in control of. And if you separate the two, the trick is to decide that everything on the far side of that line, all you are, everything other than your thoughts and your actions, everything else is fine. This was their big lesson. If you decide those things are fine, nothing bad happens, and you avoid unnecessary disturbance. Now, it sounds a bit complacent, particularly if we feel that there are social injustices that need to be corrected, for example. Then it's like, well, that's out there in the world. That's perhaps out of my control, but it isn't fine. But then you need just to distinguish between those parts you're in control of and not. So it's a little like playing a game of tennis. This is a good model also for thinking about, I think, success in your own life. If you go into a game of tennis determined to win the game, determined to achieve a result that is not under your control, you're going to make yourself anxious. You're probably not going to play as well. If the other person starts to win, you're going to feel like you're failing, right? Whereas if you go in deciding to play your very best, to do the very best that you can, then there's no anxiety if the other person starts to beat you. And likewise, in matters of social injustice, you can commit yourself to doing the very best you can to change something. But that is different from trying to achieve a result and then becoming bitter and anxious when the result isn't being achieved, because that result may come a generation later. So it can sound complacent when you first say it, but it isn't. Not when you start to break it down. But it's a very helpful model, and I find it, particularly matters of relationships and so on, all those sort of everyday stressors, to go, hang on, is this something in my control or is it not? If it isn't, how would it be fine? How would it be okay if that thing is the case? And then you let that thought just sort of drip into your soul, and then you can decide how much or little you actually want to involve yourself in it, but that then comes from you. Does that make sense?
And yeah, it makes a lot of sense, but I can see the intellectual part of it, but I can see the practical bit of like releasing that worry being harder to do. Is that a skill? Is that something you found that has worked with practice? It's a bit like NLP and CBT type of techniques of recognizing something and then giving yourself permission. But how have you found learning that skill?
I think it helps if you are naturally disposed to it. I think if you're driven by an anxious impulse to fix things and to get involved, you find it hard to let things go. On one hand, it's going to be more difficult, just from a constitutional point of view, but also it's a very useful thing to learn because it can just help pull those things back a little bit. If, like me, you're naturally, as I said, more introverted anyway, and I'm very good at avoiding challenges and stress anyway, but to my detriment, because that also means you don't always grow, you don't always explore and move on. Then it can come more naturally. But the key is practicing it, and that realization that, oh, it is fine. Like if this person's annoying me and bugging me, and this thing that they said or this thing that they did, it's always fine actually that they did that, and it's always fine that they think that, and it's just letting that sit, and then you start to get used to it. You start to do that thought process, and it starts to become familiar. And also, of course, like all these things, it isn't the answer to everything, and I'm obviously kind of making it sound quite simple anyway. It isn't the answer to everything, and it isn't always easy. And I don't think it's any notions of happiness should be about something that sounds like an easy fix, because happiness is, you think of it as a noun and it misses all its complexity. It's a verb, really. It's a very active process. It's a byproduct of finding meaning, for example, which is a different thing. I think if you approach it too directly and make out that it's easy, it falls apart. But I think a model like that is certainly very helpful at reducing unnecessary anxiety, which is just a different way of perceiving what happiness might be.
And you sort of said that, optimism can be a real problem for people. So tell us a bit more about the danger of optimism. Yeah,
well, I've just lived out in America for doing that Broadway run, and I loved it. And I love being around that kind of very optimistic sense that manner. That is a very American model. But there are problems with it. And the problem with it, however nice it is to be around, is that it lets you down when things go badly. So if you imagine a graph, so on the one axis, the x-axis, you've got your aims, the things you want to achieve in life, the goals. And on the y-axis, or whichever it is, the one along the bottom, say, you've got stuff that life is throwing back at you, fortune, things you have no control over. Now, we used to have a real respect for this fortune. That was like a real thing, like the Greeks were very big on fate, right? What we're told, and what the kind of spirit of optimism tells us, is that if we believe in ourselves enough, that we can kind of crank the nature of life up to be in line with our goals. If we set them clearly and we believe in ourselves and blah, blah, blah. As if this other force doesn't really exist. The reality is that we live an X equals Y line, where our aims on the one axis are meeting and matching the stuff that life is throwing back at us. So that's actually what we do live. And the key is to make your peace with a sort of undulating line along that X equals Y diagonal, where sometimes we will be on top, but sometimes life will be on top. So actually,
right. So on average, you want to be following that line.
Well, you want to shift your expectations sometimes, so that you've made your peace with how things are inevitably going to turn. Because The trouble with relentless ascent of optimism is that when it does go wrong, and eventually life pulls us to hard places, this is just part of being alive. When it does that, we've then got to add to that reality, everything's gone a bit wrong, our own failure, because we've somehow let ourselves go. One of my weird adventures I've had at some point was looking at the world of faith healing.
Yeah.
Those kind of evangelical figures that I think sort of hijack honest religious belief and so on for their own ends. But the model of it is interesting. That thing of throw your pills away, and if the illness returns, it's because you didn't have enough faith.
Yeah.
It's the same model you see in that thing, The Secrets, the sort of law of attraction, is that you send your wishes out to the universe and it will provide. And if it doesn't, and she says this in the book, you didn't have enough faith, you didn't believe enough. And it's the same with the whole cult of long-term goal setting and so on. If it falls apart, it's your own fault. And I just don't think that serves us. I think a little bit of short-term optimism can be helpful, but in terms of looking at the way life moves, you have to balance it with a kind of strategic pessimism and a realization that life doesn't fit in with your plans. It makes no sense that it would.
So we're two British accents sitting here, and you know the work you did on faith healers and the documentary there is fascinating. But you also mentioned having been on Broadway in an optimistic country. So how was that culturally for you? Do you see a difference in optimism in the US? And tell us a bit about that experience you had of doing the Broadway show.
It's actually fantastic. The experience of doing West End in London is very different. I wasn't expecting the sort of reception. It was a popular show, but it was also, there's a kind of everybody's just great. They all work amazingly. They're lovely to be around. There's a real aura around just doing a Broadway show, which there isn't really here. You're just someone doing a job, and no one sees it as anything different. So that was it was very lovely. And as I said, I do enjoy being around it. It's a nice sort of cushion to fall upon. It's just, I just think ultimately, if it isn't tempered with a sort of just a basic understanding of how fortune will come back at you at some point, and allowing for that. That's not a negative thing. That should be a positive thing in a way, because the fact that life is difficult means that when you reach those points, rather than feeling like, oh, I've failed and I'm alone, those are precisely the points that join everybody up. That is like the precise weight of life showing itself. So that's the thing that joins us all up. It's a little bit like the isolation we're all in at the moment. That you feel most isolated, but it's the thing that joins you up with everybody else. And the only way of kind of feeling that as something kind of sublime is to allow for that in your understanding of what life is. And it isn't just about setting your goals and believing in yourself. You can spend your life climbing a ladder and then realize you had it against the wrong wall. Yes.
Well, that's a worrying thought, isn't it? But this point about all of us having a very common experience at the moment, and the sort of the common crisis that we all face, the health crisis that we face. We've all had to do that letting go, haven't we? Because these things are so big, we can't control them at all. All we can do is sort of be at home with our stuffed animals and our writing or our baking or our, I need to do my hair cutting soon, the things that are keeping us all, the same. You probably haven't been doing so much of that.
Not so much. I've really let mine go. I've been feral over the last few months. Yeah.
So just go back to the US though for a minute, because your show was called Secret. How on earth do you do, and it's sort of based around a secret, so I couldn't really find out what it was. I know people who have. How do you conceive a show like that and then convince yourself that you can keep something secret enough that the audience will want to come?
Well, there you go. That's the power of story again. So the show is full of surprises, and I would, in all the shows that I do, and this one that hopefully I'll be doing in February if things lift, or sometime around then, is it's a surprise-based thing. So I say to the audience, look, please keep the secret. And then I found in 20 years of doing these shows that people just are very happy to do that. I'm sure if you dig deep, you can find, spoilers and so on, but there's a sense of enjoying being part of that. And then that again is being part of a narrative, isn't it? There's a fun sense of involvement and coming together and being part of something. So I think it's just that. I don't think it's any reflection on me. I think it's just a lovely bit of groupishness that comes out in the same way, like the situation we're in now. We're seeing all these lovely behaviours that come out from people when they're all facing a crisis together. Yeah. I'm not comparing my show to a crisis.
No, keep giving us some escapism, I hope. And when you think about conceiving these things, as I say, you've spent 20 years really playing with story and psychology and creating an illusion from that storytelling. How do you conceive of a story that's going to be interesting and fresh and befuddling and dazzling in the ways that you have done? How do you keep doing that? Where does inspiration come from? And is there a process that you follow? Yeah,
so I have a few different things that my kind of career consists of at the moment, but the two big areas are TV shows and stage shows. So sometime in my 30s, I said I got a bit sick of this thing of magic just being about look at me. And the way I found to get around that was to make a way of finding drama, which is not there in me going, look, I can do anything. There's no drama in that. So the drama became real people going through real situations. So I do these big Truman Show style experiments where people they don't realize they're part of, some big experiment. So that is very much about storytelling. That's we tend to write the shows with a sense of what is it, perhaps what the ending is first. What are they going to find their way towards? So the last show I did, which is on Netflix, called Sacrifice, is about could you get somebody to the point that they would lay down their life for a stranger, and specifically an essentially kind of racist, very right-wing, anti-immigration American guy to lay down his life for a Mexican illegal immigrant. That was the thing. So getting somebody to that point and seeing if I could plant these things along the way to get them to do that. So it's about a kind of psychological manipulation, but it's also about a story. Stage shows are sort of a different thing. You root your ideas in theatrical moments. What weird experiences could a couple of thousand people watch in a room with me go through? And that's a fun thing, but it still comes down to I think a sense of story, where endings are important. A big difference between life and narrative is that when you watch a film or read a book, the ending makes sense normally of everything that's come before, and in life that doesn't. At the end of life, it normally just feels absurd, scary, and meaningless. So there's the one point where we should be able to find a sense of authorship and closure and meaning. It's sadly not the case. We tend to the opposite, like cameo figures in our stories, but the decisions are being made by loved ones and so on. And the only narrative that really exists now in our non-superstitious times is the narrative of a brave battle that's being fought, which isn't a narrative that serves the person that's going through it at all, because again, you're just adding failure. That sort of positive spin just adds an eventual failure. Anyway, we're probably getting a bit morbid.
Well, these are times to consider these questions. We've got more time to do them. I think one of the things that's interesting about your journey is the sort of marrying of the kind of theatrical with this fascination, it seems to me anyway, with both psychology and philosophy. And I'm sort of looking at your book. You refer quite a lot to Daniel Kahneman and to psychology, but it's also endorsed by Alain de Botton and A.C. Grayling. So philosophy is actually also endorsed by Stephen Fry, who you tried to assassinate. So you've obviously got some influence there. But how does that come about? How does that interest kind of bridge those areas? And how come Stephen Fry is still talking to you?
I know. He's considered. Well, the two used to go hand in hand. I mean, the old ideas of virtue ethics of philosophies that used to be back with the Greeks. It really was about psychology. It was about how we might live, how we might flourish, what the good life is. And then, as I said, Christianity came in and then kind of took all those questions and gave it quite specific answers on its own terms. And then that kind of level of exploration sort of sort of parked for a couple of thousand years. And during that time, what was left of philosophy were kind of drier analytical subjects that didn't really have anything to do with what it was to live well, because theology was giving us those answers. And now we've sort of drifted away from a theological model of life. We're starting to kind of join up those two worlds again, of philosophy and psychology. And there's plenty of that. And you see it in, well, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a very popular form of therapy, is based on Stoicism. So there you start to see it there, or rational behavioral therapy, I think it was called first, based very much on the tenets of Stoicism. So it is starting to join up, and Stoicism is sort of quite popular now. I think there's a real resurgence. To me, a difference is between the world of, say, positive psychology, as it's called, which looks at, you know, what makes people happy, having a certain number of friends, and, you know, living within a certain distance of friends and so on. While I think any philosophical explorations have to tally with those findings, they tend to be a sort of horizontal worldview about what works across large numbers of people. What interests me is always the inner life. And I think that's where sometimes a kind of a philosophical routing is actually more helpful. It's more of a sort of a vertical model of how do I move forward. And
because you've got a very unique career spanning and connecting these things, and the theatrics and the writing and the TV sort of almost documentary making approach. So when you think about, you mentioned, you know, climbing the top of the ladder and seeing which wall you're on. Do you feel that you've climbed the wall you wanted to climb? How does it look to you from where you are now, the way you've assembled this journey? And are you happy that that's the wall you've climbed to?
I genuinely I've never been one for climbing ladders. I studied law, and I didn't particularly want to be a lawyer, but I was just starting to do magic and gigging and so on afterwards. I just sort of felt, is my life at the moment, if I take a cross section of it, in the present moment, are things sort of in the right place, and does it feel about right? And that's all I ever had. And then as my sort of career took off, I sort of started to feel a bit like a kid in a world of grown-ups, because other people were talking about things that all sounded very ambitious and driven, and, you know, 10-year plans and 5-year plans and so on. Never really chimed with me. And in a way, I'm lucky that perhaps my own lack of drive is balanced by more business-minded people. But there's a lot to be said for that approach. I mean, Broadway I did not because there was a plan to, you know, take America. I just thought it'd be lovely to live in New York for a few months, and what an exciting thing to do. And I genuinely haven't moved past that. So it served me well, and it has also meant that I've never had any drive to be beyond what I'm doing. And I think that is often a drive, particularly with people, the performers that get known. But the trouble with those kind of drives is that they're never met. You never kind of get to that point. You tend to creep up on those points slowly anyway. And meanwhile, the people you're comparing yourselves to and everything just keeps moving further and further ahead. So I've always found that helpful, that I'm not really like that. Somebody had a model of the career, the ladder climbing image of a career, which again is a very biblical model. It doesn't sound it, but that climbing the ladder, the idea of the golden place that we're all trying to get to, because, you know, you study certain subjects at school, to go to college, to study this, to get this job, to get this promotion. Like, it's all about something that's supposed to happen when, I don't know, some point in your, I don't know what that is. But the other model is a frog on a lily pad. You know, you spend some time on one lily pad and enjoy this time, then you go to another one for a bit. And, you know, it's a horizontal model, but it's, you know, it's equally valid. I don't quite know where I am and all of that, but I think I naturally veer more towards that, and it's fine.
I mean, it sounds like a rather modest sort of explanation of how you've achieved things. Oh, you know, it'd be nice to live in New York, I'll just do a Broadway show. But there must be a drive, and there must be something, you know, that gives you real satisfaction and a sense of happiness in what you do. So what makes you feel really happy when you are happy? What is it that comes together?
I think another helpful way of looking at happiness is to see it as a byproduct of meaning. And I think particularly as you get older, there's something in the second half of life where if you're serving yourself in the first half of life, in the nicest way, but you're trying to find out who you are and what your place in the world is, in the second half, there sort of should be really a natural move towards serving something bigger than you. And that's how and that's often your kids, for example. But there should be something like that, because if you're kind of 60 and like ambitious, it sort of sits a bit odd. What was your question? I've completely forgotten what you said.
What makes you happy?
What makes me happy? Yeah, that's right. Thank you. So what I find increasingly now is finding the thing that's bigger than you and throwing yourself into that thing, right? That's how we find meaning. And the more I do that, the happier I find I am. So writing a book at the moment is delightful for me. I paint, and that takes up, like a week or so of involved in a project. Again, delightful. So I find if I don't have that, that tends to bring me down. So finding a thing that's bigger than you. And I think after that sort of midlife thing that people go through is generally about that. It's just relating a little differently to what's in your life and finding those things that are no longer about you. It's like you've slain the dragon and now you've got to rescue the princess in sort of, mythical terms. That's kind of what's going on. We need to find our princess to rescue.
And you mentioned the sort of second half, first half of life. I won't presume as to which half you're in. I think I'm probably just into the second half.
49, but thank you. Yes,
okay, yes, we're a couple of years apart, but I'm just the other side. So any advice you'd give the younger Derren? So the Derren who's at university trying to be a lawyer but really wanting to get into magic, well, that kind of time, what would you tell that younger self?
Going back to that Stoic model of things you can control and things you can't, I think any sort of pursuit of success, whatever that is, the only things you can control, and therefore this makes this a good model for understanding success, is talent and energy. You can control your talent and your energy to an extent, and those are the things that you develop. So if you've got all the talent, but you're not really getting it out there in the world, no one's seeing it, it's not going to go very far. And if you've got all the self-promotional energy but no talent to back it up, again, it's not going to ultimately serve you that much. But those are two things that you can focus on. The rest of it, what people think and whether you get the lucky gig and the phone call and the rest of it, is not under your control. And it's not your job to try and control those things, because you can't, and those things will get in the way. So you have to let those things go. And that means that, it becomes a journey and a relationship to something that you love and all of those things. And I think that is the only way of seeing it. Talent's what things look like from the outside. The inside experience is just a process and a load of, forgiven failures and false starts. And you have to not confuse what something looks like on the outside from what it is inside. So finding that.
Right. So you'd say to younger Derren, think about talent and energy. You've got too much of one, not enough of the other. What's your reflection?
You just focus on those. There's a secret to success.
Just those. Okay.
It's talent plus energy. The rest of it you can let go. Don't worry about the rest of it. Just focus on those things. But that tends to then bring with it a sense of this will be a journey. It will be an ongoing relationship to something that hopefully I love. And I think that's important.
Fantastic. I want to start taking some questions from our audience, and the first one's up here from Gemma. What advice would you give about the current situation, the stories we tell ourselves about that? Already these questions are better than mine, so it's a great question, Gemma.
Yeah, it is a great question. And again, I think there's what it seems to be coming out a lot is altruistic behavior that comes out that situations like this tend to produce. If you ignore some of the news stories, we are driven, these kind of situations do bring out the best in people. As long as we're not like fighting for food and stuff like that, then it's different. But in general, facing these kind of crises, it brings out the best. So I think, again, just reducing panic. We don't need to pay attention to the news. You can just, we can turn all that stuff off. We'll find out the important stuff. And realizing that we're all sharing in something, and it's very rare in life that we really that's really played out. How are the things that isolate us are exactly the things that join us up, as I said. That's really being played out now in a very literal way, and I think it's worth paying attention to that. Those normally are feelings of fear or loneliness or whatever, or just, we just think that's us, some sort of weird mismatched part of ourselves. The reality is everyone feels like that stuff, most of the time. So I think leaning into that, seeing how we're joined up by this, is a very helpful way, and paying attention to all the weirdly good stuff that's coming out of it.
You quoted a couple of times the modern Stoic William Irvine and his sort of thought about if there was nobody else in the world and you could do anything you wanted to do, what would you do when no one else is watching? And I wonder whether this situation's a bit like that. I've kind of observed myself, like how I dress for my business calls. What am I spending my time doing? Am I bothered about how my hair looks or whatever? Do you think there's something in that? Obviously, you're very sensitive, yeah.
No, it's true. Yes, it's an interesting thought exercise. You know, if everybody disappeared and it was just you, all the things you just wouldn't bother doing. You know, you wouldn't bother how you looked. You'd want to live in probably a small, cozy, warm place than a big, flashy. Everything starts to change. We realize how much we're doing to impress others without realizing that was really so much of our motivation. So yes, I think that does start to come out, doesn't it, in these times, when we start to realize our priorities, and you know how much like this whole thing about working remotely, you know, like this.
How can we get used to it? Let's have a look at another question. So Dirk is asking, how important is touch and physical presence to influencing people? How can you do it in a remote world? That's an interesting one as well.
It is a good question. Yeah, it reminds me of, it certainly can be used, it gets used a lot in those sort of influential technologies like hypnosis and NLP and so on, where you can, you know, attach a feeling to, as in an emotion to a physical trigger. So, you know, you typically induce a feeling of confidence or a feeling of something, and then you touch somebody on the shoulder, and you do that a few times. They start to associate the touch with that feeling. And I do this a lot in my own shows, and I use sounds. It's a bit like, you know, listen to a song when you broke up with somebody, then 5 years later you hear the song again, it just takes you back, you know. It's also important in the sort of medical world. It's something that gets a bit lost. I mean, certainly in our country, in the UK, there's you normally have your 5 or 6 minutes with your doctor, so at the National Health Service, and if that doctor tells you, take it easy, you know, relax and try not to get stressed, you're probably going to feel a bit ignored when you go away. Whereas if you go and see an alternative practitioner who is, in terms of their medicine, is peddling nothing of value, and but the fact you're spending an hour and being probably touched and being listened to, and going through some kind of ritual, it completely changes the effectiveness of something, and things tend to be a lot more effective because of your relationship with them is very different. So yeah, but to answer that specific question, yeah, obviously it's rather difficult to do remotely, but it can also be very creepy, like a lot of those NLP type things. You know, you achieve rapport with somebody by mirroring their body language and blinking at the same rate. I mean, what they're born out of is observing those things when they happen naturally. And sure enough, when people are in close rapport, they do tend to blink and breathe at the same rate, and they do tend to mirror each other's language. But something is lost by saying, and if you do those things, then people will feel very comfortable with you. I read an interview with one of the top guys in the world that does that kind of stuff. And the interviewer was saying, couldn't tell what it was. There was something really creepy. And then I realized that's what he was doing. And the whole of the rest of the interview was him saying, how weird, it's just copying everything that I'm doing. So it's very easy to fool yourself. So I'm not always a big fan of those kind of tricks.
So if you were trying to do your show entirely remotely, do you think your efficacy of manipulating or influencing people would be reduced by 50% or like 80%? You know, the touch.
I was trying to do the same type of thing, but through a medium that was completely different. Yeah, I wouldn't expect it to work at all. I'd completely start from scratch. It'd be interesting, really interesting to do. But yeah, no.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's take another question. So Rachel saying, can you tell us a story about something from your taxidermy question? Excellent. I was going to end on that. So let's what have you got that you can tell us about?
Good question. God, they're all ethically sourced. I should say this because some people really don't like the idea of taxidermy. So nothing has been hunted. They're all people's pets and things that have sort of died in zoos.
So Derren, where did it come from? What started you? Did somebody give you something? Oh, I've got to have some more.
Yeah, I knew somebody who collected them, and then he had a mistress who also collected them. So I had these two kind of quite eccentric characters when I was younger that sort of started me off. And now they're just a great barrier against any unwanted sexual attention. I placed a fox out in the bins, there's some trash cans outside the house once, where I knew the neighbours would be coming into park just so I could watch from a window. I took the trash can up and had it stood there. Yeah. And then watch from a window to see how long they would like pause in the car and wait for the truck to move, which would take a long time. And it did. It took about 20 minutes of them getting out. Yeah, not a lot of funny stories associated with taxidermy. They're apart from I've been blow drying them. I suppose that's kind of strange, isn't it? I realised they've been gathering dust over the years, and dust attracts moths. And moths, destroy them. So I've been going around with a hairdryer during this lockdown period, dead animals.
Yeah, we've probably all got cleaner houses than we once have. So there you go, Rachel. There's a couple of stories about taxidermy, an interesting use in life as well.
Knock them off as your own.
Let's try and take a couple more questions before we close. So here's Peter saying, so many self-help books and business books are written by winners. What worked for them may not work for others, and they could just have been lucky. How do we identify universal factors? Another really good question. Thank you.
That's a really, really good question. It's really worth talking about for a second. So again, this is part of the problem of the optimistic model. What you hear again and again is believe in yourself, ignore the haters, pay no attention to the naysayers, and just commit to this vision you have. And the stories we read again and again and again are people that have done that and have won out. And they're amazing stories. That's also a perfect recipe for catastrophic failure. Blindness to feedback. But you don't read the stories of the business failed. They're not writing books. It's a real problem because it's a real thing that's in the air. And all it's doing is saying, blame yourself if things don't go right. So yeah, it's so much of it is luck. So much of it is luck. It's that other force that's just at work as we move along that X equals Y line. And I've yet to read a biography that kind of says that. An autobiography rather that says, yeah, I kind of got lucky, but along the way here are a few things that I learned. We form a narrative when we need a narrative that supports the sense that we're a hero. We want to be the central hero of our story, and it's how do you not do that? I just wouldn't read the books, or just take them with a real kind of pinch of salt, and only take those things on board that feel like they might help your own sense of authorship, but just don't. It's 50% of it at least is just pure chance and happenstance, because that's the nature of that dialogue. It's a 50-50.
That just doesn't make such a good story, doesn't it? I mean, isn't that the reason? Nobody's going to write a book saying, look, I was basically lucky. There's nothing you can learn from me.
Yeah, but what you can learn from it, because that doesn't sound a very interesting sort of point to end on, but what you can learn from it, which is useful, life is messy and complex and active and ambiguous. Life is full of ambiguity. And the more we get obsessed with our truth, my truth versus your truth, my story, the importance of my story, the more we forget that we are just excluding a whole lot of complexity. Life, it just is. For everything that's true, the other side is also true. What comes out, whether it's left versus right or whatever, the truth is never in one side or the other. It's in the dialogue between the two. It's when dialogue breaks down that we have problems. So that's actually what comes out of it. Somebody's self-serving story is great for them, but that isn't how the world works. It's complex and messy, and I think just slowly that's something that needs to drip in, and then we've got a much greater chance of understanding things like happiness when we don't try and reduce them to easy nouns. They're not. They're complex, active verbs.
Great. Let's see if we've got time for one more question. If you can stay with us, is that okay?
Of course.
Philippe, hi there. Do you see value in learning more about psychology from books to achieve personal happiness? Did practicing mentalism help you get a better understanding of how we think and reason?
Yeah, I think. Look, we're all different. We're all geared differently, and somebody may benefit from a model of happiness that's about total emotional engagement. Stoicism is sort of famously the opposite of that, and that kind of works for me. So yeah, I think if it interests you, you read it and you explore and you find out what works. I have a real bias in terms of going back to the ancient sources of these things, because they really thought about in the back there. And all the literature is really accessible. It's an easy read. It sounds like it's going to be, but it really is. And it's harder nowadays because there's such a cult of sort of self-help. It's difficult to sort of pull apart what's real and what's really backed up by any kind of real research from what is just, just more stuff telling us to believe in ourselves.
And we mentioned Alan de Botton. I found his School of Life stuff, which there's lots on YouTube, but also he's written books, extremely accessible, and the wisdom of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates is incredibly relevant today.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a world of stuff there which is really, really worth knowing. If not my own book, happy any sort of introductory book on Stoicism will just present this very compelling model, which is just sort of different to what we're all told to buy into nowadays. And I think ultimately helps us, even if you just take on board a certain amount of it. I just said, I don't think any one thing is the answer to anything. It doesn't have a lot to say about kindness. It doesn't have a lot to say about community and so on. And, and also the value of anxiety. That's another thing. Yeah. And anxiety at some level is important. If you don't feel anxious about something, how do you know it needs changing? It's only when you know your job isn't right or a relationship isn't right that you change your job or change your relationship. So not fighting against anxiety and thinking again that you must have failed, but letting it sit, letting it have a place is really important, because again, life is difficult and complex, and that's fine.
Life is difficult and complex, and that's fine, but also more or less everything is going to be absolutely fine. And that seems like that is your philosophy. You seem very calm, and there's no single answer about things, but you've certainly put some of this stuff into practice. So everything's absolutely fine.
I think so. We'll all like Brexit. We went through Brexit in this country, and it's mayhem. But at the same time, we'll form a story about it. That if you didn't want it, you'll form a story that serves that. If you did want it, you'll form a story that serves that. And things we'll just sort of keep going, and we'll all form our stories. And largely. Yeah. Things will just sort of be fine, and we'll get on with them, and that's okay. That doesn't have to be complacent. That can just be a helpful route, a helpful starting point to then work from. And the Stoics, I should say, they were movers and shakers. They were politicians. They were very active people. So it shouldn't be a recipe for complacency.
Well, Derren, thank you so much for spending the time with us today and talking to us. I thoroughly enjoyed kind of reading the book and anchoring myself to some of the ancient ideas as well as the way you've interpreted them so entertaining. So a big thank you for making time for us.
Oh, this was so much fun. Thank you very much for having me, and I'll get back to writing the next one now. Thank you very much.
We'll think about focusing on talent and energy and the stuff we can do, and I think that those ideas about the stories we tell are super powerful. So thank you. Good luck with the writing, with the hair drying, and with the lockdown, and we look forward to seeing you back on stage and back on our TV screens very soon.
Really
so thank you very much.
Hello.
And thank you to everybody for joining us. That was our first virtual Talksat. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.